took money from families, and there was some question about what they were doing. So this is the home page of the site. And the first thing you'll see is that the content on the site is not just in English, because the person we want the information from might be a North Korean defector, a Laotian, a Russian. They don't speak English. So we're reaching out to them in their own languages, in their own places. And so we're using the new power of the internet, and Nicolette was talking about the website, the NAF site, and we're using some of those same things to try to do what the Pentagon is not doing, which is to reach out to people who have answers about live POWs, about people who are kept alive after the war and not returned, and their families, and other types of important documentation. We are focused on what we call disruptive information. Disruptive means it will change this issue. So I don't care how many documents I find that show the government's been lying or show guys were kept. Unfortunately, no one in power cares. Pruitt, EPA will say, oh, it's not true, or 60 years ago. Now, if we show up with the daughter of an American POW from Laos or North Korea who says, my dad was this person, he left me his ID card, and by the way, I've got half his DNA, so DNA testing will prove it. Or in the case of North Korea, if, God willing, we were able to get in touch with one of the POWs, I believe some Americans from the Korean War are still there. And by the way, this is an area the government also kept classified. There are numerous reports that Americans from Vietnam were taken in North Korea. North Korea flew fighter aircraft for the North Vietnamese. They had people on the ground. There was a whole complex relationship. And there are indications that as a reward, they were given American POWs. So those guys will certainly be young enough to do. And I think some of them, even the Korean War. This is just our group. So Charlotte Minnick, Janella is our honorary co-CEO. And we've got great people. John Zimmerly, if you're involved in the Korean War, he's a Korean researcher, dad is missing. Various other types of experts, including Norm Cass, the former guy who ran the U.S. side of the Joint POW-MIA Commission, the Russian linguist, wonderful guy, and Chuck Downs as well, who's a senior Pentagon negotiator with North Korea. So here's what we're looking for. We're looking for leads of people who have answers. Now, check out that old, can everyone see this insert that looks like old-time type? Okay. Okay. So it's a declassified U.S. government record. And it says the officer in charge of the camp for Americans who were never supposed to be there is named Xiao Chun-Fu. And it has his name in Chinese, and is a graduate of this specific university in China, and has this assignment. So the U.S. government never has done any investigation. So to give you an example, we had one of these, and it said, this officer, gave his Chinese name in English and Chinese, was in charge of this shipment of Americans moving through China. According to the Pentagon, no Americans ever moved through China in that manner. They had never checked the name list. One of our Chinese linguists followed up and found that this guy, who was in the CIA document from all those years before, was listed in the Chinese-Korean War Chinese volunteers, Korean War veterans group. We then called his house. And his family said, oh yes, he was in the Korean War. Can we speak to him? He died a month ago. But we have lots of names like this. The government has never, our government has never investigated. It's like the two Americans who were in that specific room where we've never said to the meetings, who the hell were those? So you'll see other types of people we're looking for. This is a tragic intel report. Now again, not all intel reports are true, right? So we always have to bear that in mind. But in this case, it's somebody, and a lot of it's classified, but someone who knew the daughter of a person in the village whose dad was a white guy. So the daughter tells the other person in the village who later escapes, says, my dad was in the US Army and he had a document and he told me one day, if he ever got out, this card would lead him to prove he was an American and he also might get paid some money for it. So, what do you think that card was? It was ID card. And so it talks about what happened and how her dad was not, never told of the POW exchange when it happened. Now, there are others like this. One in particular is a guy who was depressed in America, and they call big nose, which is what the Koreans often call Americans, who was working on ships in a North Korean harbor, but was moved after the Pueblo incident, which you may remember is the North Koreans seized one of our ships, was moved inland because the North Koreans were afraid that there might be military action or a rescue of the Pueblo, and they didn't want this guy being liberated. So we go for documents, but again, we're not looking for documents that are the old documents, which I love looking at, but don't do any good. We're looking for real documents that will be disruptive, that if they come out, it will create a press storm for the DPAA. So as an example, we're looking, there was a U.S. Marine corpsman and a Vietnamese, the wife of an American official who got out, said, I saw a show on Vietnamese television during this time after the war, and they showed an American who they said was our friend who is now helping us with medical issues. There are reports that a certain American who was a defector, but I believe has information on lots of Americans, was taken to Cuba and was in the newspaper in Cuba. So we're trying to get people in Cuba to look in their newspapers. So these are documents and information that would create a sting. Here's an example for the Laotian issue. The CIA released this file that said, this is the name of the official bulletin from the Laotian Communist Party for this period of time in the 60s. From 66 to 69, it had 30 Americans, the photos of 30 Americans. Now you guys tell me, how many Americans Laotians now claim to have alive? Not 30, right? So this defector comes out and said, I got this newspaper every month for this period of time and it had lots of pictures of American POWs. If this is true, it will show the U.S. government and the Laotian government were lying about the American POWs and presumably would show the faces and names of Americans who were kept but never accounted for or returned. So we're trying to go out to Laotian speakers and people in Laos and say, have you ever, in your back closet, which if it looks anything like my back closet is filled with papers and documents, do you have one of these? This is information on the guy we showed you earlier, Oh Young Nam, the police officer, and he said, by the way, I'll show you exactly where they keep the Americans in North Korea. Here's a map on it. And the U.S. and then the top guy in DPAA, then DPMO, said we have to do something right away, and he was squelched into all of these things. This is video of American POWs in North Korean hands. I love this one. It was actually on the National Archives website, and it shows these Americans being handled by the North Koreans. The Pentagon had no idea this existed and never attempted to identify these guys. So we interface with groups, as we talked about, people, who from other countries whose loved ones were kept, academics, all sorts of. So the website. As an example, this year we've been getting a lot of unique visitors from Vietnam, and I broke it down as to what towns. Now our Vietnam veterans probably recognize a lot of these towns, and they're ones that show up in a lot of reports. So we're getting people from places who theoretically would have information from us. We have received information. The website has a secured email. Well, it's not really email, but it's a secured file transfer system that is very, very difficult for anybody to break, so they can send it, but we also recommend that they mail mail information without a return address and to our sort of generic sounding address in the States. So we have started to receive some mail from Vietnam. So I like the countries we're getting to at this point. You have the card. We always love help. A great way is just to tell people you know to visit the site, and especially if we have anybody who has friends who are refugees from any of these countries. So if you know a Russian, if you know someone who came here from Vietnam or those places, it would be great if they will spread the word, because all they need to do is send the link to a site to everybody they know back in that country. So that is the POW Investigator Project, and in some ways it's based off the old blood chit. You all may probably remember the blood chits, and you may have carried them. It's basically a U.S. flag. It has the languages of the theater where you're operating, and it says, I'm an American fighting man, if you take me to the Americans, you'll get a reward. The Pentagon refuses to use this. And so we heard your story where a guy gets to the border and says, I can get American out, and the U.S. representative says, too bad. So we are doing this. The POW Investigative Project is a journalism organization to get some of the protections so the government isn't able to come kick down my door. What we do offer compensation for people who can help us with consulting. So for instance, if someone were to find us that Laotian publication, I would be willing to pay that person. So, actually, last slide. These are the quotes that I'm sure you've seen before that sort of animate what we do. So, any questions about that? Okay, Bill, do you want to come up and take over?
Okay. Question about the, you mentioned DNA a while back.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that whole process?
I'm
pretty familiar with it?
Yes, and the DNA is now being used by law enforcement to do familial DNA investigations. So we assume that if we get DNA or the daughter of someone or some other DNA, that the feds will not be helpful to us. They'll find some excuse not to do it. About 90% of Korean War families have DNA in the database. We believe we can do, using private laboratories, we can do the same process that allowed California to catch the serial killer, which was they ran the DNA and they said, okay, whoever this person is has a first cousin in California, has an uncle here, and try to do it that way.
What if from Vietnam, the people submitted the DNA to the government here recently, last 5 or 6 years ago. And the government has them. And all of a sudden you run across a guy who claims to be the husband of, or never mind that, but the person, the wife had submitted her DNA, and now the husband shows up live. Do we have any claim on our government providing us with that?
No, I assume that they will not, or that
How can they withhold it?
or they will bury it. Well,
Why don't we bury them?
yeah, well, a couple scenarios. If the daughter, and we saw the report that was allegedly from the daughter, shows up, I think there's a good chance she will know her dad's American name. Not necessarily, but there's some good chance. And we're looking for these kind of identification media, so she might have that ID card. So she shows up, and she said, and she's obviously an Amerasian, which in North Korea is very rare. It's not like Vietnam. And she says, my dad was an American POW, and here's his card. And we look at that card, and it's a real card of an American who's missing from Korea, right? That would trigger us to take next steps. I believe there's a 90% chance that that card belongs to the missing loved one of a family who's provided DNA. So obviously part of this would be going to the family and saying, hey, we don't want to shock you, but there's this Amerasian woman who got out of North Korea, part of this is predicated on the fact that over time it's been possible to buy people out of North Korea. It used to be $10,000. It's been tougher lately because Kim Jong-un has been killing people for that, but there are ways to get stuff out. So we're interacting with people who get stuff out. So we go to the family and say, look, this woman claims that she is your loved one's daughter from North Korea. Or say we just get the card out and there's some DNA on it and the daughter is still in North Korea, or maybe we arrange for the man who's in North Korea to give us some DNA, right? There's a good chance that if we have a name, we can find the family member. And my guess is that most of the family members would be supportive of going to DPAA and saying, we demand that you test this immediately. We also think the DPAA will do anything they can not to test it, to screw it up. And in that case, we would probably see if we could do that familial research, DNA research, to see if we could find relatives of the DNA provider and whether that might allow us to get a name and track back from there. Does that go to your question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, this has been quite a time for 3 decades. I want to give a little history on the origins of the National Alliance. Sorry about that. What is it? Oh, okay.
It's tied up.
Oh, there we go. It was, I think, around 1990 that Mark broke the story of the Korean War POWs that weren't returned when he was reporting for Cairo TV in Seattle. And I just happened to be going over to see my mother one day, and I heard the promo on the radio that Cairo was doing this with Mark. So I sent Mark a letter, and I just asked him, gee, my dad was MIA from Korea, and we really don't know anything. And so then both my mother and I interviewed with Mark, and we started finding more and more information. And that's where I met Dolores, was about that time. And Dolores was working, it was called the Concerned Citizens of Washington. And it was just a small group in Tacoma of veterans and maybe 3 or 4 family members. And out of that grew the National Alliance. And one of the funniest things I think that happened in the very beginning was when Mark had the press conference at the National Press Club here in DC. A man came up to me and said, "Oh, the National Alliance," and he said, "Where's your office?" And I said, "No office." And he said, "What?" He said, "I thought you had like a big office somewhere." And I said, "No," I said, "It's just 3 of us. It's Dolores, myself, and Sig Harback, who was a Vietnam veteran for the agency. He worked in the Cowboy Project. But anyway, and he left, got out of the agency because of the treatment that they were doing to Vietnamese women. And so that's his story. But anyway, just between the 3 of us, things started rolling. And family member after family member started finding out about it and coming in. And as the years went by, Mark was getting more and more declassifications and information for us. Plus he wrote the 3 books, which are really definitive on the MIA POW issue from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. I think the Vietnam one was the men we left behind. Yeah. and then his latest book,
American Trophy.
yeah, American Trophies, yeah, which was mostly about North Korea. So I can hardly believe that this is 30 years. But I've been doing it since 1950. And when my dad was reported missing in action at Kunari, North Korea, which was the headquarters for the U.S. Army 2nd Division. And when the Chinese came in to the war, they literally overran the entire 2nd Division, and which created the highest loss of any American division since the Civil War. I think there were over 7,000 men that were killed, captured, or wounded in just that 10 days. However, at the time in the 1950s, a lot of the media accused the 2nd Division of being cowards and this sort of thing because they had a bug-out order from Tokyo, which was every man for himself, and the whole division went into panic. Had they been ordered to stand and fight, they would have repelled the Chinese. And shortly after the division reformed as a fighting force, their kill ratio was 20-1. And eventually the pressure was put on the Chinese where they withdrew. So in that action, my father was with the 38th Regiment Mental Company, and he was a combat medic at that